Hey there. So, for this peer review assignment, we wanted to investigate the current literature pertaining to how mental illness is represented in children's television. We are going to give brief summaries of two relevant studies that looked at this topic, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the implications that portraying characters in a certain way might have on the formation of stereotypes. The first study that we're going to look at is the depiction of mental illness in children's television programs. It was first published in 2007 by a team of researchers at Hartford University. Their question was, do children's television programs depict characters with mental illness in such a way that fosters stigmatism towards mental illness? They looked at over 269 hours of programmed children's television. They classified children's as any program with a target audience of 14 years or younger. They had 4 raters in the study, and each televised program was viewed by 3 of the raters. The study was conducted so that no one combination of 3 raters rated more than a quarter of the programs. For a character to be rated as mentally ill, the mental illness had to be implicitly stated within the show, not as judged by the raters personally. This was to avoid bias by the raters. The study was interested in how the characters reacted to each other and how that might influence how a child may interpret the show and the characters. So that was really important to avoid that personal bias by the raters. The following networks were included in the study: ABC Kids, PBS, Fox, Warner Brothers, Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, Disney Channel, and CBS. The study identified 21 mentally ill characters overall from all of the hours of program that they watched. Most mentally ill characters were male, Caucasian, single or of unknown marital status, jobless, and without a parent family. The characters often exhibited aggressive or violent behavior. They used weapons, verbal threats, other types of violence such as kidnapping. The acts of violence were purely malicious or retaliatory in nature rather than self-protective or self-injurious. And none of the characters were distressed by their own aggressive actions. They were more likely to be shown as villains who are dangerous, unpredictable, and cruel. That all sounds very negative, but there were some positive attributes that were shown. However, they were limited. So some characters were portrayed as being well-groomed, and a third were rated as intelligent. However, only 4 could be described as productive members of society, with only 1 character being rated as responsible and reliable. Negative behavior was often exhibited towards characters portrayed as mentally ill. Specifically, they were excluded and treated with a lack of respect, such as being referred to as crackpots or nuts. The most common response to a mentally ill character was fear, followed by violence towards that character. Characters were likely to be made fun of and ridicule character that had been deemed as mentally ill. And furthermore, no characters showed affection towards a mentally ill character. So there were some treatments options that were shown in these children's television shows. However, only 8 characters of the total 21 were seen as receiving treatment of any kind, and most of these treated characters were simply hospitalized. Treatment success was uncertain for 5 of the characters and explicitly not helpful for 2 of them. An example of one character who was treated was in the show Scooby-Doo. Here is a picture of Professor Pericles. He's a main antagonist of the show, and he's shown here in a straitjacket, which we typically consider to be sort of an archaic form of mental health treatment. Now I'm going to give an example of a character that was analyzed in this study in a little bit more depth. So here we have Mr. Crocker from Fairly Odd Parents. He's described in the show as the mentally unstable school teacher. He's also one of the main antagonists of the show, which you will see is a theme here, that the antagonist of the show is often portrayed as being mentally ill. He is depicted in this picture here with an ear growing out of his neck, doing an equation that really doesn't make any sense. And he's looking generally quite wacky. He's got chalk in his mouth and his one eye is bulging out of his head, which is quite frightening. And in this other picture, you can see his brain is literally coming out of his head, also very concerning, and his eyes are 2 completely different colors, and he's looking quite out of sorts. The second study that we looked at was mental illness specifically in Disney animated films, and their objective was to examine the prevalence of verbalizations about mental illness in the animated feature films of the Walt Disney Company. So they really wanted to look at whether these things that we were seeing in television, these representations of mental illness, also showed up in shows by the Disney Company. So they analyzed 34 feature-length films by the Walt Disney Company. They created a coding method whereby the raters judged mental illness based on the verbalizations made about or by the character in the show. So again, these were implicit verbal statements in the show, not as judged by the raters on appearance or anything like that. They coded for 64 words referring to mental illness. For example, crazy or lunatic were two words that were commonly used. In addition to the 64 words, there were 37 phrases identified as referring to mental illness, such as out of one's mind and not in touch with reality. The study did not include out of context use of words, such as phrases that refer to a situation like this is not crazy, or when words were used in negation, such as he is not crazy at all. This just goes to say that they didn't say that this was an instance of referral to mental illness when it was used out of context. They looked at family favorites like The Lion King, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and Dumbo. So most of the characters referred to as mentally ill serve as objects of derision, fear, and amusement. References used to designate an inferior status of the character. This means that when they were referring to someone as being crazy, it really was to denigrate a character, not to raise them up in some way. They found 85% of films had reference to mental illness in some form. More specifically, 21% of all principal characters were referred to as mentally ill. For instance, Maurice of Beauty and the Beast, Jafar of Aladdin, and Mrs. Jumbo of Dumbo. Now, I want to go into a little bit more detail on specific characters that the study identified. Here's a picture of the three hyenas in The Lion King. They are portrayed as being mentally ill, as is demonstrated by their eyes frequently rolling back in their heads throughout the film. They have a high-pitched hysterical laughter, and they're seen as having a lack of intelligence. They are the main or one of the main antagonists in the show, and are deemed the lowest social group in the animal kingdom. And they are feared and avoided by the other characters. In this picture, the character on the right is depicted as being very aggressive. The character on the left seems to be sly and untrustworthy, and the character in the middle is depicted as having lower intellect, which is sort of a recurring theme for these characters, as they're often seen to be confused and are easily tricked. And to really drive this home, Eddie, who is described as being the craziest of them all, is at one point seen to be gnawing on his own leg. The second example is Maurice from Beauty and the Beast. He's Belle's father, for anybody who needs a bit of a refresher. His depiction has more subtle implications than the hyenas previously discussed. Obviously, their depiction is very negative, but he has nothing actually wrong with him, and he's simply an intellectual, but he can be seen as a bit eccentric. He is at one point threatened by the villagers to be taken away in the lunacy wagon if he doesn't adhere to the societal norms. This highlights how someone who may be different can be threatened with the label mentally ill, and that some may even have the power to lock that character away because of it. This could result in a child attributing non-conforming behaviors to mental illness, and may in turn lead these children to ostracize peers that are different. The long-term implications of this research: how mental illness is portrayed in children's television leads to the creation of stereotypes of mental illness from a young age. It really just gives children a platform and a really bad model from a very young age of how we should react to mental illness, how we should see and perceive mental illness, and how we should treat mental illness. These depictions lead children to think sufferers of mental illness are unstable, violent, of lower intellect, untrustworthy, and unable to be contributing members of society, which, again, we just know is not true. In the first study, it was seen that treatment options were typically not considered for characters, or if they were undertaken, they were seen as ineffective. This implies that mental illness is untreatable, which we know, again, is not true. Now, if someone has this preconceived notion about treatment and then they themselves become a sufferer of mental illness, they may not be open to treatment options and may see their condition as unchanging. This combination of modeling and reinforcement that we see in children's television is one of the most potent tools of socialization. This may have the potential to teach prejudicial attitudes and distancing behaviors towards individuals perceived as being mentally ill. And we believe that once these beliefs are formed, they are likely to continue into adulthood. This all goes to say that we need to spend some more time thinking about how we represent mental health and mental illness in children's television shows and movies. We don't want to encourage the formation of stereotypes based on these models that we are giving children that are not accurate representations of mental illness. Thank you.